Good morning, everyone. Those of you whom I know and those of whom I don't know yet. So, pardon me if I'm not used to using PowerPoint that much. And the PowerPoint that I've done is very, very primitive. I've been to a few presentations recently, and they've got music, and they've got art, and it's like phenomenal. So in the write-up that Sean created, we have about a master's degree's worth of topics, and they're very, very rich, and they're actually very, very sophisticated, and I have some things to say, and I mostly am offering a whole bunch of resources for you if you're interested in reading and pursuing these issues. Some of them are really open-ended, and I don't know that we'll ever come to a full understanding or appreciation of them, and that's fine. There are some mysteries in life, and some of them have to do with the intersection of spiritual life and mental health. And so we will start. Rather than going through all the topics, there will be in the PowerPoint. The first one, and to read it as it is in the brochure at length, as mindfulness and meditation are increasingly recognized as valid and useful tools in psychotherapy and Western medicine, the origin of these practices in religious and wisdom traditions often get obscured or intentionally omitted. Well said. So, it is amazing to live for many decades and survive. When I first got exposed to Oriental mysticism in 1964, through a lecture by the then Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, it would have been unthinkable for a majority of psychotherapists to espouse interest in meditation, mindfulness, Buddhism, Hinduism, or Jewish or Christian mysticism. That was just not part of the psychotherapeutic world. And today, maybe about 10 years ago, I was at a conference, joint conference, presenting with Daniel Siegel, and in a lecture to therapists, he basically said those who do not teach mindfulness to their clients are committing therapeutic malpractice. So in the course of about 5 decades, we've gone from 0 to 60. And say a few things about that. I'll refer to it here now. If you're not familiar with it, there is a resource online called academia.edu, and they've got, of course, the free version, and then there's the for-pay version. Right now I'm on the for-pay version, and I pretty much get humongous, whether it be PhDs or review articles about mindfulness and psychotherapy, about twice a week. And so if you're interested in this particular topic, mindfulness and psychotherapy, I really recommend to you academia.edu. There's an enormous amount of very, very interesting resources from all over the world. There are people doing research on this everywhere from New Zealand, Australia, China, and of course the United States. So within the Buddhist tradition, mindfulness is taught throughout all of the traditions and diverse countries with different contexts, languages, goals, and purposes. Oops. And that in itself is a very rich conversation and topic. For the moment, I'll just talk about mindfulness in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. This is the tradition that's alive in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and it's spread back to India and in the West. The teaching that is the source of this is called the Discourse on Mindfulness, and one good classic source on this is Nyanaponika Thera's Heart of Buddhist Meditation. I recommend it. There are many, many books nowadays on mindfulness, just mindfulness itself, and of course mindfulness in psychotherapy. So just a brief abstract out of that. One of the guidelines is like this. This is actually a quote from the text. When the mind has aversion, she or he discerns the mind has aversion. When the mind is without aversion, she or he discerns the mind is without aversion. This is a kind of practice many are familiar with today in the practice of mindfulness, imported into a therapeutic milieu. Just kind of out of curiosity, how many of you have, I don't know what to say, participated in, studied, teach mindfulness? How many of you in it? Yikes. Yeah. So in 1964, that would have been 0. And you wouldn't have been able to find any books either. So most practitioners of mindfulness in the therapeutic context would not be familiar with the following traditional practice from the same traditional text. And further, the monk or practitioner remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the Four Noble Truths. And how does a monk or practitioner remain focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the Four Noble Truths? There is the case where she or he discerns as it comes to be that this is stress, this is the origin of stress, this is the cessation of stress, this is the way leading to the cessation of stress. In brief, 2,500 years ago, the practice was embedded in the Indian worldview of karma, which is a belief that there is rebirth, that ethical actions lead to pleasant rebirth, unethical actions lead to unpleasant rebirths. Rebirth is seen as a bondage. Practice of mindfulness was part of a large armamentarium of practices to free the individual from the stress and suffering of rebirth. By the way, in the Theravada tradition, I've read through at least the four major discourse collections, which in translation, it's about maybe about 12 books. There's one other collection I'm not that familiar with, but in the major discourses, there's really no discussion of mental health as we understand it in the modern West. There's really no discussion of improved functioning at work. And there's very, very little discussion of improving relationships as we understand relationships in the modern West. And I'm saying that because, you know, if you look at the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of the Psychiatric Association, the criteria for mental health, going back to Freud in the modern West, have to do with an ability to work and engage in relationships. And that's what we are immersed in our culture, and that's what we're concerned with. But if you look at the practice of mindfulness traditionally, there was no tie-in to what we call mental health, no tie-in to relationships. The tie-in was into a worldview of rebirth. Rebirth is filled with suffering. How do we escape? We escape by understanding the processes of mind and body in such a way that there is actually a freeing and a liberation. Obviously, very, very big topics, but I just say all of that to point out that there is a big, big disconnect between the tradition as it was taught and used and how we have absorbed mindfulness into the modern Western psychotherapeutic world. If you're interested in some major overview resources on mindfulness, I can recommend this one by Shinzen Jung, who was a colleague with me in graduate school. And Shinzen has gone on to become a very, very successful meditation teacher, and he himself has studied many, many traditions. He's very, very gifted, both as a practitioner and as a scholar and a researcher. And if you want to know everything about the practice of meditation, he would be the go-to guy. Also, Eleanor Rosh, who is a very, very renowned cognitive psychologist, very, very deep involvement with Buddhism, has got, and I just saw this within the last 2 weeks on academia.edu, The Emperor's Clothes, look, okay, typo behind, The Western Mindfulness Mystique. Again, it's a review article. So the relationship of contemplative practices and modern psychology. Yeah, and this one I've actually I've just witnessed. I know some of the key players. So fast forward to the 1960s, when people in our culture like Alan Watts, D.T. Suzuki, Richard Alpert, Timothy Leary, Karen Horney, and Eric Fromm saw some overlaps between the values of traditional meditation and modern psychotherapy in terms of freedom from repetitive patterning. When I heard Richard Alpert in 1964 talk about Oriental mysticism at the time, it was that meditation could free us from the type of bonding imprinting that we find in little baby geese when they're relating to their parents. Geese will just follow their parents and mimic what their parents are doing. This kind of imprinting is very, very useful for both geese and humans. But if as humans we find ourselves restricted in our range of responses, it can become a kind of straitjacket. Alpert's point at that time was meditation could free us from that kind of limitation and restriction. I, in my own life, by the time I was hearing him in 1964, was already familiar and aware of the fact that I was a bit obsessive, maybe a little bit more than a bit, and that it was very, very painful, and that I really wanted to become free of that kind of obsessionality. And I was actually shocked to learn that there were people on this planet who were talking about something that was very, very intrinsically interesting to me, but I didn't know that it was a field of knowledge or research or discussion. And really, I had what probably could be described at that point as a conversion experience, just listening to Richard Alpert. He also talked about the capacity for love that we as humans have, and that can really be developed much more fully. I was just stunned and thrilled and really eager to learn a lot more. So that was the beginning of my journey. In the 1980s, John Kabat-Zinn decided to use mindfulness in the context of a med-surg unit at a hospital and found it had positive results in terms of recovery and ultimately reduced stress and anxiety. And his first major work, at least, was Full Catastrophe Living. It's a wonderful read, and it is about mindfulness, and it's the basis of what went on to become the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. During the later 1980s and early 1990s, as I was coming online as a therapist, I started noticing that mindfulness practice, abstracted from its Buddhist context, was showing up in books related to diverse clinical issues, ranging from anger to couples therapy and depression. Diverse therapists, some coming to mindfulness strictly through the mindfulness-based stress reduction of Kabat-Zinn, introduced this practice to their clients. Others steeped in the traditional Buddhist materials may have more complex nuance of what they attempted to expose to their clients. So I was trained at Boston University in the School of Social Work, secular clinical social work, and maybe because I started off my life as a PhD in Buddhist studies and was used to teaching Buddhism, and was aware of Buddhism as a religion, and maybe it's just my own personality, but my own inclination, being a social worker and a psychotherapist, was to never take a particular religious position with my clients. I've worked with clients of many, many faiths, and I take a very, very respectful attitude towards those faiths. I have on occasion taught mindfulness to my clients, but I've never been inclined or interested in trying to transmit any kind of Buddhist information as such to my clients. I haven't myself seen that as an appropriate thing to do, and actually have some fairly strong feelings about the separation of secular psychotherapy from religious traditions. A colleague of mine, and he actually interviewed me, and I haven't read it, but I apparently am somewhere in this book, Ira Helderman, wrote a book, Prescribing the Dharma, Psychotherapists, Buddhist Traditions, and Defining Religion. And he's found that there are some psychotherapists who are quite oriented towards trying to transmit Buddhist material or some elements of Buddhist material as they're doing therapy. So even there's quite a range of what people are interested in doing. So, as to the diverse usage of mindfulness in psychotherapy and the broad range of research on its effectiveness, I can recommend academia.edu. Also on Facebook, there's probably a lot more. There's a mindfulness and psychotherapy group, and then there's a issues in the mindfulness movement group. I think Shinzen Young's review article came up on the issues in the mindfulness movement. Sometimes there is some stuff that comes up on that particular Facebook page that's fairly critical of mindfulness. And just to give you a bit of an overview on that, we're not going to go into this at length, but Buddhism certainly talks a lot about clinging and hatred and reducing clinging and hatred and developing harmony, love, and compassion. What's happened, this is just kind of an aside in a way, but it's very, very interesting to be able to look at culture as well as things like the hardcore issues of psychotherapy and Buddhist practice. We have some very, very definite cultural values that we live in. And one of the ways we become more aware of those cultural values is when we become involved in other cultural values. So Richard Schwader, who is a cultural psychologist at the University of Chicago, has written a fabulous book called Thinking Through Cultures. And he talks about the process of really engaging with another culture. And I love what he says, and part of it is that ultimately there's a dialogical relationship. The more you learn about another culture, the more you learn about yourself. The more you learn about yourself, the more you can see in what's going on in another culture. So our culture is pragmatic, which means we want to know what works. And so we take something like mindfulness, which originated in a monastic kind of setting where people were supposed to be reducing craving, involvement with worldly concerns, reducing passion. That was its historic origin. And, it comes to the United States, and we then get mindfulness in successful business operation, mindfulness in better sex life, mindfulness in better tennis game, mindfulness to become, successful in life and, become a power player. And these are our cultural values. And it's okay, they are our cultural values. But if you've seen Buddhism in Thailand, and you put it in contrast to, I'm going to have a much better tennis game by studying mindfulness, it's kind of shocking, actually. And part of that is the culture and the history within which it arose and it was maintained, and part of it is our culture. So it's just something has been abstracted and been imported, and in some ways it's been done so very, very usefully in some of the aspects within which it's used in psychotherapy. But some of it, this all started with issues in the mindfulness movement. There are some people who have a fair bit of vitriol about what's become of mindfulness, especially in the, I think they even put it in these terms, modern capitalist environment. So it's, if you have a taste for that kind of cup of coffee, it's an interesting set of critiques to sometimes look at. For me, the most valuable integration so far that I've seen, or that there are many, I'm sure, but I really appreciate David Wallens' attachment in psychotherapy. First of all, it's probably the best one-volume introduction to attachment theory that I know of in the English language. And he presents the research that he was, up to date. Now the book is probably about 10 or 15 years old. That the ability to self-reflect, technically called mentalizing, associated with secure attachment. And the person who's done the most work in this is, his name is Peter Fonagy. He was just here about 3 weeks ago. He's mostly based in the Freud Institute in England. He's a phenomenal researcher. And he studied secure attachment, and he and John Allen at Menninger Clinic came up with this term mentalizing, which is kind of a tongue breaker. But it's really self-reflection, the ability to reflect on oneself and the ability to reflect on others. And that with secure attachment, we have this ability. Absent secure attachment, it's very, very difficult for people to reflect on themselves and or reflect on others. So it seems that mindfulness practice seems to be a way to enhance this capacity and enhance emotional flexibility. And so it can, in fact, be a very, very useful adjunct to psychotherapy. And so if you're a therapist and you either want to send your clients off to do a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. Could be very useful, or you can learn some mindfulness yourself and teach them. It's just giving a client some capacity that starts with reflection on their own processes, but through reflection on our own processes, we do get to be able to be more sensitive to both ourselves and others. Third topic that Sean brought up was the usefulness of distinguishing between psychosis and spiritual experience. Fasten your seatbelts. It's a really great topic. So some of the resources that I recommend here are starting with Sigmund Freud's Future of an Illusion, Anna Maria Rizzuto, The Birth of a Living God, and then this last one is, it's an article by James Jones, The Use of Winnicott in the Psychology of Religion, and a book by Janet Jacobs called Religion, Society, and Psychoanalysis. And that one's available on Google Books for free. Again, I mean, gosh, there's just so much on the computer nowadays. So, psychosis. What is psychosis? Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms. And I had to look up what negative symptoms refer to. So it's blunting of affect, poverty of speech and thought, anhedonia, that means an absence of pleasure, and reduced social drive. So we could devote a whole college semester course to Freud's decapitation of the religious world. So, by identifying religion as an illusion, he was using both an ontological scythe and an epistemological hammer. The transcendent object, God, is discounted as an illusion and discarded, and anyone who has perceptions related to the discarded object is suffering at least from epistemic error, if not frank mental illness. So Jones's article details how Preuser, Rizzuto, and Meisner want to move illusion from its negative, unreal connotation more into the realm of Winnicott's transitional phenomena, which are located between is and is not. Using transitional phenomena as a way to capture a large swath of human experience is a rich way to speak to the whole realm of art, religion, and cultural artifacts. I recommend this article. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Winnicott, I couldn't recommend any mental health writer more. And you can find his article on transitional phenomena for free somewhere on the internet. And he's a little bit chewy to read. He's very, very kind of paradoxical and terse. But I would recommend that if you're interested in his creation of, he's talking about baby blankets when he's talking about transitional phenomena. And the baby blanket is somewhere between being the mother and not being the mother. It both is and is not the mother. And he just makes a kind of throwaway comment that in that transitional phenomena are the basis for art, religion, and cultural artifacts. And a few people have then taken that and run with it. And that book that I referenced has some chewy articles on that. Just the one that I really read was the one by Jones. But it's very, very helpful for considering religious phenomena in a open way without needing to tie down the whole ontological issue. Does God exist? Does God not exist? And to leave it in a kind of recognition that this is just, we can leave it open. So we can say that Winnicott, with his developmental epistemology ontology, offers a rich counterpoint to Freud by emphasizing both the origin of and significance of being able to entertain experiences that hover between the black and white extremes of ontological existence and non-existence. So back to number 3, namely the usefulness of distinguishing between psychosis and spiritual experience. The bad old days for spiritual experiences. Back in the day, there was probably a period when a client presenting with diverse spiritual experiences, speaking to God, seeing angels, seeing the devil, prophesying the future, or speaking in tongues, might have immediately been diagnosed as suffering from delusions and perhaps been offered anything from medication, shock treatment, or long-term hospitalization, if such an individual dared to visit a psychiatrist or mental health professional. Is there usefulness to distinguish between psychosis and spiritual experience? Is it psychosis or spiritual emergency? So, again, online, I don't know how I found this one, but it may have come up in academia.edu. This is PhD out of Australia. The differentiation of psychosis and spiritual emergency. I didn't have time to read it, but just looking through the table of contents, it's kind of encyclopedic. It's a very, very rich issue. I don't know if this organization is still running. There used to be an organization in Palo Alto called the Spiritual Emergence Network. They used to have a lot of good stuff online. This all kind of started off in the 80s, 90s, where people were looking at what's called Kundalini syndrome, coming out of Swami Muktananda world and the world of Yogi Bhajan, Happy, Healthy, Holy organization. There is a way in which I'm more familiar with this in the practice of Asian traditions, but it's certainly the case that when people go off to do intense religious practice, let's say a 10-day mindfulness course, and at least, I don't know exactly how they're doing them now, but when I did this in the 70s, we were supposed to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. In those days, when I was in India, we would listen to our teacher, Goenka, chant at 4 o'clock in the morning. Then we would be meditating until about 6:30 when we had a little bowl of gruel. Then there would be a lecture at about 8 for half an hour, and then there's meditation till about 12. Very skimpy lunch of some 2 or 3 little containers of vegetables, rice, and a little bit of yogurt. And then meditation from about 1 to 5 or 5:30. Maybe there was tea or milk at 5:30. There was no food. And then meditation till 9. And no speaking. Now, most of this was in theory for, people doing their first course. But eventually you would work your way into it. But people in these situations often go batshit crazy. And, I forget the name, and maybe you know the name of this guy. There was a guy in the 80s and 90s who was a Jungian who basically wrote a book that said that schizophrenia was basically spiritual journey, and that in working through schizophrenia, you were kind of on a spiritual path. So the questions that arise, so what is the nature of these experiences that people come up with, let's say doing intensive meditation? How do we understand them? How do we understand even, let's say, something like schizophrenia? If we have a spiritual perspective. And so, needless to say, this is hotly debated. 99% of the psychotherapeutic world probably will say something like schizophrenia, no spiritual joy there. And there is a small, actually I think Podval, who was a psychiatrist out of the Naropa world, I think he had a little bit more benign sense of schizophrenia and psychotic processes, and at least wanted to use community resources to have people move through or deal with the process of schizophrenia. And I'm not saying that I have a closed or settled position on this. I think there's a lot to think of and a lot to understand, but just to begin with, to say that intensive religious practice, whether it be probably somebody going off and praying for 30 days or 20 days or 10 days, or fasting or meditating, certainly seems to be a stimulant for surfacing issues. Now, whether that is surfacing issues which we could call kind of manageable, and within, maybe we could call it like the neurotic frame of, I went off and I got really, really anxious when I was meditating, or I got depressed, or, I seemed to touch into the divine. There may be a lot of unusual things that occurred during the course of intensive spiritual practice. And then there are people who come out of even something like 10 days and are kind of dysfunctional. And, we have to decide what we do with such individuals and how we work with them. And part of it is the language and culture system that we're embedded in. We again, Schwader's got a wonderful article on, I think it's called "You're Not Sick, You're Just in Love," and he talks about 3 different narrative sort of schema that we have in the world today. So we wake up with a headache, and one schema for understanding why I have a headache is because somebody made a doll that looks like me and took a needle and put it into the head of that doll. And that's a narrative schema that's quite widely believed in many parts of the world. We can call it voodoo or magic. Another narrative schema that's widely believed in large parts of the world is the karmic, which is I wake up with a headache, and why do I have a headache today? Well, in some past life I kicked somebody in the head, and therefore I have a headache in this life. And then the third, which is actually, as I've thought about it more and more, he calls it the psychosomatic schema, which is I wake up with a headache, and this is the one that's popular in the West. I have a headache because my boss screamed at me yesterday, and this morning my head aches. And that would be the psyche description. And the somatic would be I wake up with a headache today because there's something wrong with my brain chemicals and I probably didn't take an aspirin at the right time or my medication, which is a somatic intervention. These things are not black and white, but just to say that when I was with my Tibetan teachers, and if I was in the course of meditating getting anxious, they have their version of Xanax, which is not at all as useful as Xanax, by the way. It's called Agar Songa, or Agar 35. It's and you know, I would eat a lot of that. It didn't exactly work for me, but within the Tibetan context, my anxiety, first of all, was understood as a somatic issue. It was understood in terms of wind disorder, and they had a somatic kind of intervention for it. But it's just to say that during the course of spiritual involvement, some very, very interesting things arise, and it's an enormously complicated subject. For a Buddhist review of this, and I haven't read it all, I was just sort of looking at it, but even some of the paragraphs were just so chewy, you know, you could think about them for weeks and months and maybe even years. Jared Lindahl, Somatic Energies and Emotional Traumas, a qualitative study of practice-related challenges reported by Vajrayana Buddhists. So, you know, this is coming up in the context of thinking about things like psychosis and spiritual transformation experiences. And it's just to say that, you know, whatever the tradition, whether it be Judeo-Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, clearly people all over the world have visual, auditory, different experiences. And I'll be saying more about it in just a few moments. I think it's very, very important for us to A, acknowledge this, and B, not necessarily jump to premature conclusions as to what we're dealing with. So, what do we understand as religious leaders, therapists, scholars, or of religious studies? First of all, we don't reduce every out of the ordinary experience to a pathological state. That may have passed in the 1930s through the 1950s, but we are past that. Nor do we, in my opinion, see every alternative experience as spiritual with a kind of blanket slate naive approval. So just because somebody comes in and is saying stuff that's really out of this world, I mean, I don't think that we just say, aha, and that's sweet. I mean, we have to have some criticalness about ourselves and who we are and what we're dealing with in our clients and our parishioners. So recently, my colleague and friend Catherine Stevenson gave a talk on related issues at the Psychoanalytic Society. I think it's about a year or two ago. And she basically said there are situations which are simply spiritual, simply mental health, and mixed. And I think it's a bit of a sane approach to an extraordinarily complicated set of issues. So back to Sean's questions, ways we can understand transcendent states without leaping to pathological judgments, importance of destigmatizing the spiritual dimensions of congregants and clients' spiritual experiences. So I'm going to way simplify here and just generalize, but so simply religious. I was working in a children's care situation, and there was a child with a definitive brain cancer terminal diagnosis. He was going to die. I mean, in working in a children's hospital, it's very, very hard, very, very difficult. The mother was in a prayer group that received messages from God. And one of the messages they received was that the boy would recover. And I felt I was in a kind of an interesting and important position. One, I really wanted to respect this woman's prayer group and the communication she was getting from in this prayer group. But, part of me is a kind of a hardcore scientist, and I tend to believe research doctors. And they said the kid was going to die, and I could imagine that the kid would die, and if the mother was wired in a certain way and felt that God had said the kid would live, that she not only could lose her child, but she could lose her faith. And, wow, that would really be a lot for somebody to go through, to lose both their child and their faith. So, I put on my best humble hat, and I just said, is it ever the case that the messages that you get are not actually on target? And I was so relieved when she laughed, and she said, "Of course, Harvey." So, which was great. I mean, it was truly relieving that, there was, and that in a sense was an act of mentalizing. She was reflective enough to know that things are not necessarily concrete, written stone, black and white, that there's space around human phenomena. And, but that, that was spiritual information, and I respected it. But I also wanted to see, as a therapist, what we could do to open it up a bit. Simply mental health. So a client came in after doing a set of physiological, they hadn't started off as a client, but came in. There was a time when I was kind of known as this guy who worked with people involved with spirituality and psychotherapy. So she came in to see me because she had done a whole set of physiological practices, and she was really agitated in body and mind, and she could not find any rest and could not find any recovery. And even within the community within which she did these practices that set her off, there was no recourse at that point. I just said, maybe helpful to connect with a psychiatrist and get evaluated. And just by accident, 10 or 15 years later, I bumped into her at a mental health training, and she was enormously thankful to me for A, helping her get diagnosed as bipolar, and B, she had then went on to train as a therapist herself. Obviously was very, very interested in the whole field. And then there's situations which are mixed, which is namely numerous individuals who range from, anybody with an adjustment disorder or trauma or personality issues, who will, in addition, talk about premonitory dreams, recollections of past lives, intuitions, visitations from the dead. I don't know about you all, but I mean, as a therapist, or just as who I am, I'm a big ear, so people like to talk to me, and this stuff is pretty common. It's pretty darn common. Certainly within the Buddhist world, many people will talk to me about past lives. This is very, very frequent. Premonitory dreams, intuitions. It's very, very common. So recently I have trained with Claire Petit-Mongeon, who is and Michelle Bitbol. They do something called phenomenological inquiry. And it's couched in the history of Western phenomenology, which is a philosophical study, starting with Husserl, and turns out there's a kind of philosophical phenomenology, and then there's practical phenomenology, and what we're talking about here is practical phenomenology. But the first guideline in this kind of mode of inquiry is to suspend judgment about the ontological status of the object. So somebody comes in and says they're having a conversation with God. If I'm in this framework, I don't have to decide whether God exists or not. We're just bracketing that question. You're having a conversation with God. And then the second is to explore the experience of the subject without judgment. And, what is happening with that conversation with God. Somebody I was talking to who was also quoting Catherine Stevenson was saying something like healing hallucinations and maybe disruptive hallucinations, whatever, these other authors were talking about illusions. There may be a kind of transitional phenomena that people are working with. And in many, many instances, we don't have to come to any judgments, A, about the phenomena or the object, and B, I think the important thing as a therapist or as a religious leader is what is the nature of the person's experience with reference to these out-of-the-ordinary experiences. How is it affecting their lives? How is it affecting their spiritual life or their relationship, their ability to work? And there's some of these things have really no effect whatsoever. They're just kind of curious, but sometimes they do. And, it's important to figure out how to help a person deal with these out of these ordinary experience. So as modern individuals immersed in our cultural paradigm, an individual's ability to work and be in relationships are a kind of bottom line in terms of need for care and the intensity of care. So at least as a therapist, I'm certainly always interested in what is my client's ability to work and to be in relationships. And there are certainly some boundaries where if somebody were coming in and there were issues of either danger to oneself or others, or there was a level of distress that was really impinging on a person's capacity to work or to be in relationship, there may be a need for exploration of organic or psychiatric causation. I guess I would just put in a little side note here where I did have a situation where somebody was presenting with extraordinary experiences, and it was actually a case where I was consulting with Catherine Stevenson, and she would have liked for there to have been a kind of even a brain scan to see if there were any abnormalcies of the actual physiological brain. Sometimes people are having unusual experiences because something's going on, either brain chemistry or brain physiology. But barring those really intense experiences where people are a danger to themselves or to others, or they can't really sit comfortably in their own skin, there are huge gray areas that maybe the best thing we can do for ourselves and for them is to just be with it, negotiate, and not try to medicate it out of existence. I had a client once who was bipolar. I'm very seriously and dangerously bipolar, engaging in a lot of self-destructive behavior. And she walked in once after a stint at a hospital, and they had really pumped her full of stuff. And, you know, it was sort of like, "Hello, Harvey, how are you?" And I was sitting with her, and I mean, I'll just fess up and say, I was saying to myself, is this better than what she was dealing with? I mean, they had medicated the crap out of her, but gosh. But also the behavior that she happened to be engaging in was very, very dangerous to herself. So these are really difficult, sometimes, situations. So, actually speeded through this way quicker than I imagined, but we'll have some time for conversation, which I think might be exciting. Finally, not suggested by Sean, but added by me, is the spiritual dimension of psychotherapy itself as a kind of endeavor. You know, how many of you are therapists in this room? About 70%. And those of you who are ministers or pastoral counselors, it's about the same. Obviously, there's a spiritual dimension in what you do. So one of the most seminal works I've read is Buber's I and Thou. I recommend it highly. It's written in 1923 at the height of scientism. You know, science in the early 20s was just going to solve the world's problems. And certainly when I was young in the 50s, 60s, that was still the case. I mean, science was it. Buber's is an eloquent evocation of the enchanted attitude that was being overshadowed by the instrumental relationships of I-it. I-thou, by contrast to I-it, is an open, indefinable, mysterious type of relationship and marks a deep religious and interpersonal moment. For us as therapists and pastoral counselors, a deep message we can absorb from any of the contemplative traditions is to slow down. And in slowing down, we can move into what's called bottom-up processing, where the ordinary can move into the extraordinary. Our simplest encounters have the potential of embodying the riches of presence, spirit, and kindness in the here and now of encounters with our parishioners or clients. So, just before I read these definitions of I-it and I-thou, or exemplifications, I-it really refers to the empirical attitude that is embodied in the modern scientific world. We live in Houston, Texas, which is an engineering town, so the world of I-it is very, very heavily represented in our culture here. I-it has to do with objects, objectifying, manipulating, measures, making things happen. Very, very important for the world. And I-thou has to do with, Buber was writing in a kind of theistic context, had to do with the indefinable relationship with God, with another human, but I think it very, very well translates into the Buddhist and Hindu context as a kind of attitude and perspective that is opposed to an attitude or perspective that is really trying to manipulate or objectify or make use of experience, as opposed to that, an attitude that is open, perceptive to the mysteries of experience. So, it, according to Buber, a person perceives what exists about them, simply things, and beings as things, and what happens around about the person, simply events and actions as events, an ordered and detached world. This is the world of Descartes. This is the world of, I'm going to forget his name now, but the sociologist writing in the late 19th century called the world of disenchantment. But you cannot meet others in it. You cannot hold on to life without it. Its reliability sustains you, but should you die in it, your grave would be in nothingness. Or on the other hand, now this is the I thou, a person meets what exists and becomes as what is over against them, always simply a single being, and each thing simply as being. Nothing is present for them except this one being, but it implicates the whole world. Measure and comparison have disappeared. The world which appears to you in this way is unreliable, for it takes on a continually new appearance. You cannot hold on to its word. It comes even when it is not summoned, and vanishes even when it is highly held. It is not outside you, it stirs in the depth of you. If you say, soul of my soul, you have not said too much. It is your present. Only while you have it do you have the present. Between you and it, there is mutual giving. You say thou to it and give yourself to it. It says thou to you and gives itself to you. Through the graciousness of its comings and the solemn sadness of its going, it leads you away to the thou in which the parallel lines of relations meet. It does not help to sustain you in life. It only helps you to glimpse eternity. And then this last slide is just a few resources. Daniel Stern's The Present Moment in Psychotherapy and Everyday Life is a kind of an amazing work. Stern was a really unbelievable being. He really, I think, was one of the pioneers in early infant research. And then what he does in the present moment, it's fascinating to me insofar as he not once refers to anything by way of Buddhism or Hinduism in terms of mindfulness. He's really drawing just from the Western tradition in this book, but it's a real appreciation of the present moment, and also the present moment in the psychotherapeutic encounter. And it's replete with insights in terms of mentalizing, although I don't think he uses that term. And Diana Foch's The Transforming Power of Affect is also an appreciation of how relationality can be really amped up in the psychotherapeutic encounter to make it a much richer and, I'm tempted to say, more humane encounter, both for the client and for the therapist. So with that, I will press the pause button, and I'd be happy to have some conversation with everybody in the audience. At a certain point, because I wrote my book, people decided that I was I didn't say anything about this actually in the book. All I said was that people who meditate sometimes need psychotherapy. But people decided I was some kind of expert on psychosis and psychotherapy. So for a while I was getting some referrals. I don't actually claim to be or pretend to be an expert on psychosis and psychotherapy, but I think I would say this. It's kind of like there's psychosis and there's psychosis, meaning there are a lot of people who can be kind of psychotic and function. And I'm tempted to say, so what? Okay. So you've got either a devil or God in your backyard, and you come in and talk about that, and you're really pretty convinced that they live there. And, you know, the devil is giving you a really bad hair day, and God is anointing you, and, you know, it's really a cheerful Tuesday. And that's the thing. I mean, if that's the kind of psychosis we're dealing with, I think it would probably be good for therapists to be able to tolerate that and people to be in their life, and if they can go through their life. You know, I read, I don't know, it's about a year ago, where in England they were dealing with a lot of schizophrenia with really just people getting to the point of being able to say, you know, so I'm hearing voices right now, and I'm hearing voices. So part of it is, in fact, a person's ability to do just that, to mentalize that there is a kind of part of them that is hearing and there's part of them that is a voice, which is very different from, you know, I have to kill someone, God is speaking to me, and no reflection in the middle. And so I think that what I was trying to say is that not every psychosis, you know, or psychotic manifestation, you know, these may be illusory experiences that, you know, we can just work with. There are, you know, it's kind of like everything in our culture. We have presuppositions in our culture that a pill is the most powerful intervention for everything, and better than that is surgery. It's very, very cost intensive to devote 5 people to a person who is out of control. There are not a lot of, I think, experimental situations that are exploring such treatments. Like I say, Podvoll, Podvoll, out of Naropa, and he's written, certainly was into doing that, but they, as I understand it, they even use some moderate amount of medication. Interestingly enough, Peter Fonagy, whose name I just mentioned, gets up at this meeting on shame that we just had that was put on by the Menninger Hospital. And Peter Fonagy is kind of like, as far as I'm concerned, he's the king of psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic research. And he's amazing, and he's a human being. He's kind, and he starts off by saying that 95% of the psychological research is based on about 19% of the world's population, and that historically, it was a really, really rich presentation. Historically, people who were traumatized were dealt with in the community. And he actually said, towards the end of his talk, he said, you know, we sitting with our clients individually who are traumatized, we can do a little bit. What we need to do is immerse them in community. So just to prolong this a little bit, some of the research that he showed was, if you ask most Westerners what is the best thing to prevent death, most Westerners will say physical exercise. That turns out to be somewhere between 4th and 6th as really causing better mortality or less mortality. What's best is social support and social integration. But in our culture, which is so oriented towards individuality, we can't even appreciate that social support and social integration is actually health-giving and prevents dying. So there's a whole, go get them. There's a whole area of research that is waiting to happen in terms of group support for emotional distress up through psychosis. But it's, as I say, it's very, very labor intensive, and it's not part of the model that exists in our culture right now. And I think it should at least be an area of curiosity for all of us. Is that an alternative to what we do with people? So, but I think barring the person who's coming in and, so I did this, weekend and I can't sit still, that person, get thee to a doctor and get something in your mouth, because, you can't even put a fork to your mouth. That's a necessity. But absent that level of physiological distress or dysregulation, or, I really have got to kill somebody, or I've got to really kill myself, and I got to do it tonight, barring those emergent kind of intensities, why not involve either group or individual therapy and talk and see what's going on? And, I think part of it is our own anxiety, but if you develop a little bit of a tolerance for people saying some very strange things, or, nowadays, if I were younger, there's a very, very interesting branch of psychotherapy that's come online over the last 20 years, maybe 30, internal family systems therapy, Richard Schwartz. And he deals with parts. And it's very, very effective, and they're dealing with very, very distressed people. So, that's something, if you're interested in that kind of thing, you could study that. Other questions or observations? Yes, sir. Yeah, I think that service and community are enormously rich avenues of human, both emotional and spiritual development. And again, we're dealing with a tough culture here. Our cultural value of autonomy and individuality, it's really tough. I'll just, one of my recent bandwagon books, which I will advertise, it's called Running on Empty. It's a great book, written by a psychologist. And her anecdotal observation is that people who have not been supported in their emotional development, and I'm going to backtrack it for a second and explain what that is, have two really dramatic characteristics. And one is they are great caregivers. Well, three characteristics. Great caregivers, terrible at receiving care, and tremendously, what do they call it? Counter-dependent, I think, is the technical word, which just means they don't want help from anybody, and they do things on their own. And so what is the absence of emotional development or support? It's, I'm as a child, I'm angry, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. And you don't have feelings like that. You don't say things like that. You shouldn't, or you're ignored, or there's no acknowledgement of feelings, there's no discussion of feelings, no support for the world of feelings. And this is pretty epidemic in our culture. And the results are kind of disastrous. But one of the sets of results has to do with this autonomizing, this worship of selfhood and independence to a point of toxicity, and it's supported in our culture and in our theories, and it really doesn't work. So I appreciate you bringing up, service and relationship. I think there's a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of cultural anti that. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, so a lovely instance, and I think you mentioned something about Aboriginal culture, where people walk in and report they're hearing voices, and many mental health professionals hearing that immediately pull out the prescription pad, but with some patience and some discriminating inquiry, is this actually kind of the clients were not necessarily reporting something external in an illusionary fashion, but it may have been something that they had internalized and were repetitively and habitually hearing something that they had internalized. And that what was important was to discriminate actually what the client's experience was, and especially in the context they weren't being of danger to themselves or others, just to very, very carefully see what was going on and not just get too excited by the phrase, I'm hearing voices, and immediately jump to a conclusion of mental illness. So, yeah, terrific. Good for you. Yes?
Going back to mindfulness and
To?
mindfulness
Yes.
and the way that it's been translated into the psychotherapeutic endeavor in sort of Western culture, you were talking about the contrast of some authors and voices that come out with vitriol about the loss of the context of the original tradition.
Right.
And not signing on to that, I got that piece. But sort of in the spirit of the gray area again, I'm wondering if there's anything that comes to mind for you, given your study of Buddhism, that doesn't presently get translated into the application of mindfulness in psychotherapy that you feel like is a loss, or said another way, an opportunity.
So the question is, are there things from the Buddhist tradition of mindfulness that are not getting translated into the Buddhist context that would be useful? I'm going to take that one away as something for me to meditate on. But one of the things, this is not what you asked, but I'm just going to throw it out and maybe conclude with this, is that one of the things that I've been emphasizing a lot, and in a way it's in tune with this book, Running on Empty, and the fact that many people in the Buddhist context are great at caring for others but not caring for themselves, is that there are tremendous meditations in Buddhism on love and compassion. In fact, I wrote another book on that called Love and Sympathy in Theravada Buddhism. What has happened in the West is that people have taken those meditations and turned them to working with compassion for self. And I have, within our spiritual community, started emphasizing a lot that a lot of people in spiritual practice end up taking spiritual practice as an excuse for self-flagellation. And there was actually a friend and colleague of ours who, this is a version of it, but was going off for a retreat to cultivate compassion, and people were coming to visit. And he said, I wish that all these people would stop bothering me so I could start meditating on compassion. This is true. So, that's interesting. It's interesting how the mind works like that. And so we in the West, I think, really do carry a burden of self-hatred and self-criticism that those of us who are spiritual teachers, I think, really need to pay a lot of attention to, because people take our spiritual instruction and guidance and will often flagellate themselves with it. It's not part of what I think is meant to happen, but it's a very, very painful part of a process that, at least for now, I'm very, very concerned about and I try to talk about. But with that, I think we've arrived at our time. Thank you all.